When I look back on 2017, I realize how badly Claire and I just wanted to start fresh. We were both 20-somethings, tired of bouncing from one crumbling apartment to another. She was finishing her nursing degree, working clinical rotations that left her drained. I'd been working night shifts at a printing press, the kind of job that wears you down slowly, like sandpaper against your patience. Money was tight, so when we found a small duplex on Hawthorne Street in Cedar Falls, Illinois, it felt like a blessing. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a little porch with cracked paint. It wasn't much, but it was ours. Cedar Falls was the kind of Midwestern town where everyone claimed they knew everyone else, though we quickly realized the familiarity was more surface than substance. People waved, but they didn't linger. The town had that small-town politeness that always carried an undertone. We keep to ourselves here. The landlord mentioned the man who lived on the other side of our duplex. Howard Green, he said, adjusting his ball cap. Widower, been here 15 years. Quiet guy, never caused me trouble. Our first impression matched the description. Howard was a man in his early 60s, maybe older. Thin frame, gray hair slicked back, pale skin that always looked like it hadn't seen enough sun. He wore the same beige cardigan and brown slacks almost every day. When we introduced ourselves, he nodded politely, offered a stiff smile, and went back to trimming the rose bushes in front of his side of the porch. Claire leaned into me as we walked back inside. "Seems harmless," she whispered. I thought so too, at least at first. It started small. On our first week, Claire called me while I was at work. "Ryan," she whispered, voice trembling. "I think I heard someone in the hallway between the units, slow footsteps, then this knocking. 3 times. It came from the wall." I told her it was probably the old house settling. Every old duplex groans at night. But then it happened again, always around 11 or midnight, when the rest of the neighborhood was quiet and Claire was alone. One afternoon, I tried chatting with Howard while he clipped roses. "Nice garden you've got," I said. He glanced up. His eyes were pale, watery blue. "Roses don't talk back," he muttered, then gave this faint, unsettling smile. I laughed awkwardly, not knowing how to respond. Later, Claire said, "Did you notice how he never looks at you? He just kind of stares through you." I brushed it off. People grieve in weird ways, I thought. He'd lost his wife, maybe he was lonely. But the more we settled in, the stranger things felt. Boots moved on the porch. Claire's umbrella leaning in the wrong spot. The porch light unscrewed more than once. Then came the night that changed everything. I'd just come home from a long shift. The rain was pouring, streetlights glowing in hazy halos. As I stepped from my car, I saw Howard's curtain twitch, and in that brief second I caught a glow inside. Candlelight. Curiosity froze me in place. Through the thin gap in the curtain, I saw his living room wall. It was covered with photographs, dozens of them. My stomach dropped when I realized they weren't family portraits. They were pictures of me and Claire. Groceries, porch conversations, Claire studying by the window. And then, as if he felt me looking, the curtain snapped shut. I didn't sleep that night. I told myself maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe the candlelight distorted things, but deep down I knew. And I couldn't tell Claire. Not with her exams coming up. She was already anxious, already on edge about the knocking in the walls. Instead, I bought a small door camera online. I installed it quietly above our front door one afternoon, saying it was just for package theft. The footage I caught 2 nights later made my blood run cold. At 3:47 a.m., Howard shuffled up to our door in his slippers. He leaned down, pressed his ear against the wood, and stayed there. For almost a full minute, breathing, listening. Then he stood and walked away as if nothing had happened. The next morning, I couldn't take it anymore. I walked over as he was watering his roses. "What the hell were you doing outside our door at night?" I snapped. Howard blinked, his watery eyes calm. "Checking for drafts. Old houses like this, air seeps through the cracks." "That's not your job," I shot back. He tilted his head, voice dropping low. "You should be more grateful, Ryan. I see things before you do." Then he smiled faintly and walked inside, shutting the door behind him. I told Claire that night, showed her the footage. She broke down crying. "We have to tell someone. Landlord, police, I don't care. He's watching us." So we called the police. An officer came out, spoke to Howard, then returned with a shrug. "He's harmless. Little eccentric maybe, but not against the law to stand in his yard or in the shared hall." Claire stared at him like he was insane. "He's stalking us." The officer sighed. "Look, unless he makes a direct threat, our hands are tied." For weeks, I barely slept. Claire swore she heard whispers through the wall when I was gone, even her own name. We started keeping every light on. I kept a baseball bat by the bed. Then one morning, I opened the mailbox to find a plain envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with shaky handwriting. "You leave at 6:42. She leaves at 7:15. Don't change your routine." My hands trembled as I read it. He was tracking us. He knew exactly when we came and went. I showed it to the police. Same answer. No threat, nothing they could do. But I knew. This wasn't harmless anymore. By November, the fear had become routine. We lived with it the way you live with chronic pain. Nights were the worst, especially when I was at work. Claire would text me constantly. Footsteps in the hall, TV sounds from Howard's unit at 4 a.m., the faint smell of candle wax seeping through the walls. One night she called me sobbing. "I swear I heard him whisper my name, Ryan. He was right behind the wall. I heard him breathing." I wanted to quit my job, but we couldn't afford it. So I started coming home on my lunch breaks, driving 20 minutes just to check on her. Every time I'd catch Howard peeking through his curtain, always watching. The breaking point came on a stormy November night. Power went out across the street. The rain was pounding, thunder rolling. I'd just come back from checking the breaker when I saw Claire standing in the living room, candle in hand, her face pale as chalk. "Ryan," she whispered, pointing at the window. I turned, and there he was. Howard stood inches from the glass, rain dripping down his face, a twisted smile spread across his lips. He didn't move when I yelled. He didn't flinch when I pounded on the window. He just stood there smiling. It wasn't until another car's headlights appeared, our neighbors returning home, that he finally stepped back into the shadows. By the time I ran outside, he was gone. We barely slept that night. Claire begged me to leave, but we had nowhere to go. Our lease wasn't up and we couldn't break it without penalties, so we endured. Then, 2 weeks later, Howard moved out, just like that. No goodbye, no explanation. The landlord said he left no forwarding address, but the mystery was only beginning. When the landlord agreed to let us peek inside the empty unit, I expected clutter, maybe stacks of newspapers or bottles. Instead, it was spotless, unnaturally so. No dishes, no clothes, no furniture. But the spare bedroom told a different story. The wallpaper was faded in neat rectangular shapes like dozens of frames had hung there for years. The outlines covered every wall. Photos, I thought. All removed. All. I searched for hours, hoping to find one shred of proof. Something to show the police, something to explain why Howard had spent months watching us. But the room was bare. That night, Claire asked me, "Do you think he's still watching us?" I didn't know what to say. We moved out the next spring. We found an apartment across town, closer to her hospital rotations. Life went on. We tried to put Cedar Falls behind us, but the memories stuck. I still check my porch light every night before bed. I still scan my blinds twice before leaving. And every now and then, when I'm walking to my car in the early morning, I swear I feel pale blue eyes on me. Years have passed. Claire and I are married now, living in a different state, a different home. On the surface, life is normal, but the scars from that duplex remain. Howard never resurfaced. No police report ever tied him to another incident. Maybe he died. Maybe he just moved on to another town, another set of neighbors to watch. What I know is this: safety is fragile. We convince ourselves we're secure. Locks, cameras, community watch. But all it takes is one neighbor with too much time and too much obsession to unravel it all. I tell this story because people should pay attention to the small signs. The umbrella moved, the light unscrewed, the footsteps in the hall. We brushed them off until it was too late. The moral I carry is simple. Trust your instincts. Don't let politeness or denial blind you. When something feels wrong in your own home, act. Protect yourself, even if others dismiss it. Because in the end, it wasn't the silence that haunted me. It was lying awake at night, knowing a man just inches away was listening, watching, waiting for the right moment. And the truth is, sometimes you never know if he's really gone. I was 25 when I first signed the lease for that little townhouse on Cypress Grove Court in Raleigh, North Carolina. Looking back now, I can still picture the row of modest, attached homes lined up like polite neighbors who didn't know one another's names. Each unit had the same beige siding, the same square patches of grass, and a parking lot in front where the asphalt was just beginning to crack. It wasn't the type of place that impressed anyone, but it was quiet, affordable, and most importantly, it was mine. At that time in my life, I was desperate for space that didn't come with roommates. I'd spent years living with friends in cramped apartments, dealing with dirty dishes, missed rent payments, and the constant noise of someone else's life overlapping mine. I craved independence. I wanted to wake up, pour my coffee, and sit in silence without tripping over someone else's shoes. Most of the residents on Cypress Grove were either young professionals like me or older couples who had downsized. The vibe of the place was polite but distant. You'd wave when someone carried groceries, nod when walking to your car, maybe trade a quick evening in passing, but that was it. I liked it that way. That's why my neighbor Mike Carver stood out so much. Mike was in his mid-40s with sandy brown hair starting to gray, a permanent 5 o'clock shadow, and a kind of forced friendliness that at first felt neighborly. He waved when I moved in, offered me a toolbox when he saw me struggling to hang curtains, even helped me carry a heavy box inside. I figured he was just one of those guys who liked being useful, but there was always something a little too much about him. He asked too many questions. What I did for work, whether I lived alone, how late I usually stayed out. I chalked it up to small talk until one day he grinned and said, "So you leave around 7:15 every morning, huh? And you're back by 6 most nights." He said it like he was proud of himself for noticing, but the hair on my arm stood up. That wasn't small talk. That was surveillance. I tried to brush it off. People noticed things about their neighbors. It didn't mean he had bad intentions. But the way he looked at me, the way he lingered on his porch whenever I left or came home, it started gnawing at me. Still, I told myself not to be paranoid. It was just a townhouse. Just a neighbor. Just coincidence. That illusion shattered one spring night when I pulled into the lot later than usual. My headlights swept across the back fence of my yard, and I caught a figure leaping over it. My heart stopped. I parked crooked, jumped out, and ran toward the gate. But by the time I got there, whoever it was had vanished into the shadows. My chest heaved as I scanned the alley behind the row of homes. Empty, silent. I told myself maybe it was a teenager cutting through, maybe someone drunk who got lost. But deep down, I felt the truth pressing against my chest. I already knew who it was. The next morning I tried to play it casual. Mike was outside, watering the small patch of shrubs in front of his unit. I walked over, pretending to stretch, and asked, "Hey, did you see anyone hanging around my yard last night? Looked like somebody jumped the fence." He didn't even blink, just stared at me with this strange expression. "You probably imagined it," he said flatly. Then, before I could respond, his tone sharpened. "Why would you think it was me?" The knot in my stomach twisted tighter. I hadn't accused him of anything. I just asked. But his reaction felt immediate, defensive, rehearsed. From then on, things changed. He started watching me more openly. Every morning he stood on his porch with a coffee staring until I drove away. If I came home earlier than usual, I'd catch his blinds twitching. I wanted to confront him again, but I could already hear his denial, already picture the way he'd twist it back on me. A few weeks later, my friend Samantha came over for the weekend. We stayed up late, sitting on the couch with a bottle of wine, half watching a rerun of some crime show. Around midnight, a sound outside cut through the quiet, a scraping near my car. Sam froze. Someone's out there. We crept to the window and pulled the curtain back just enough. 2 men stood by my car, one shining a flashlight inside. My breath caught in my throat when I recognized the taller man's profile. Mike. Sam whispered, "Is that your neighbor?" Before I could answer, the adrenaline took over. I yanked open the door and shouted, "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" The men froze. Mike turned his head slowly, looked directly at me, then without a word walked back to his townhouse. The other guy jogged off into the darkness. Sam's hands were shaking as she called 911. The police arrived 20 minutes later. They knocked on Mike's door, but he never answered. I explained what we saw, gave them his name, described the other man. The officer nodded but seemed unconvinced. Did they damage the car? Take anything? No, but without a crime, there's not much we can do. We'll keep an eye out, he said, his voice almost bored. Sam glared at him, whispering to me after they left, "Don't be alone with him. Ever." I didn't sleep that night. Every creak in the walls made me flinch. The thin drywall felt like it couldn't possibly protect me from the man just 1 unit away. The next morning, I found something on my windshield, a folded piece of paper, no envelope. Inside, in blocky handwriting, was a phone number and a message. "Call me. We need to talk." My stomach dropped. I didn't need to guess who it was from. I showed it to Sam before she left. She shook her head, her expression hard. "Do not call him. Promise me." I promised, but curiosity clawed at me. That afternoon, I typed the number into a search bar. My hands went cold when the result popped up. It belonged to a local middle school, a faculty directory. Mike Carver, social studies teacher. The thought of him creeping around my car at midnight, then walking into a classroom full of kids the next morning, made me sick. I considered reporting him to the school, but what did I have? A note, a bad feeling, no proof. It would be my word against his, and I'd come off looking paranoid. The following weeks were suffocating. He never mentioned the note, never asked if I'd called. But the way he watched me said enough. If I came home late, he was there on the porch. If I left early, his blinds parted just enough for me to see a shadow. I started avoiding my own house. I stayed late at work, ran errands just to kill time. When I did come home, I parked at the far end of the lot so I wouldn't have to walk past his porch. But even then, I could feel his eyes on me, burning through the dark. At night, I locked every window, checked the deadbolt 3 times. I kept a heavy wrench by my bed. Sleep became a stranger, and through it all, the police never called back. It didn't take long for my townhouse to feel less like a home and more like a trap. I lived in constant dread, waiting for the next note, the next scrape at my car, the next shadow moving outside my window. I avoided inviting anyone over. I didn't want my friends exposed to the tension, the creeping fear that seeped through the walls. Even phone calls became difficult. I didn't want to talk about it, didn't want to admit how unsafe I felt in the place I'd fought so hard to afford on my own. Every time I saw Mike, I felt smaller. He didn't need to say anything. The silence was worse. A slow, knowing stare when I walked by. The faint smile when I pretended not to notice him. It was like he was daring me to say something, daring me to accuse him, knowing nobody would take my side. Finally, I reached my breaking point. I called my landlord, explained I needed out of the lease early. He wasn't happy, but I agreed to pay a penalty fee. It was worth every dollar. Packing up felt like escaping a war zone. Every box I taped shut. Every trip I made to the car, I half expected Mike to appear, to say something to stop me. But he never did. He just stood on his porch watching, that faint smirk never leaving his face. When I finally pulled away from Cypress Grove Court, car loaded with the pieces of my life, the relief was overwhelming. For the first time in months, I could breathe. It's been years since I left that townhouse, but the memory of Mike lingers like a scar. I live in a different city now, in an apartment where I barely know my neighbors, and that's exactly how I want it. But sometimes, late at night, when I see a shadow in the parking lot or hear a scrape outside my window, my heart still races. I can't shake the feeling that people like Mike don't just disappear. They move on. They blend in. They find new neighbors to watch. I think about that note sometimes, the one that said, "Call me, we need to talk." What would have happened if I had called? Would he have tried to pull me closer? Involve me in something darker? Or was it just another way to tighten the leash, to remind me he knew I was scared and powerless? What unsettles me most isn't what happened, it's what didn't. The police never took me seriously. The school never knew. Mike never faced consequences. He walked back into his job, into his life, into a classroom full of kids, as if the nights of lurking and watching had never happened. The moral I carry from that time is harsh but true. Not everyone who seems friendly has good intentions. Pay attention to the small details, the questions that dig too deep, the patterns that don't feel right. And when your instincts tell you something is wrong, don't ignore them. Because the scariest neighbors aren't the ones who make noise or cause trouble. It's the ones who smile, who seem helpful, who watch quietly from behind the blinds. And sometimes the most dangerous thing about them is knowing that no one else will ever believe you. I remember the first time I felt the quiet shift in our neighborhood. Maplewood Heights in Naperville, Illinois, had always been the kind of place where parents chatted across white picket fences, kids played until sunset, and the streets smelled faintly of fresh-cut grass and blooming azaleas. I was 14, and to me life was simple. School, video games, riding bikes with friends, and helping my mom with cookies in the afternoon. My younger sister Sophie, 10, was my constant sidekick. Our parents, Dad, a civil engineer, and Mom, a small-town baker, balanced work and family life so effortlessly that it seemed our bubble of normalcy would never burst. Then Greg Turner moved in next door. I didn't notice him at first. He was polite, smiling when we waved, seemingly the kind of neighbor who would fit in. But there was something in the way he looked at us, at our house, that made my stomach knot without reason. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and had a stare that lingered too long, like he was cataloging us. The first incident was almost laughable, at least at first. Dad had accidentally let the garden hose stray into Greg's flower bed while watering the lawn. Greg came storming over, face red, voice loud enough to turn heads. "Do you have any idea how long it takes to repair my azaleas?" he barked. Dad's voice stayed calm. "I'm sorry, it was an accident. I'll pay for the damage." Greg muttered something under his breath and retreated, but the air felt charged. That night, I lay in bed. Sophie snuggled against me, hearing the soft rustle of leaves and thinking about that glare. It was just a neighbor, I told myself. Just a grumpy neighbor. But my gut whispered otherwise. Over the next week, the little things started. Greg parked unusually close to our driveway, lingering in his car long after sunset. Footsteps on the sidewalk when no one should have been there. A window across the street catching a reflection that seemed too deliberate. Sophie noticed first. "Liam, he's staring again," she whispered one evening while we played in the yard. "Probably just bored," I tried to reassure her, but my own voice sounded hollow. That night, Dad picked up the landline to hear only silence. Then faint breathing, then a whisper. "You'll see." We didn't talk about it much. Mom insisted it was a prank, but the air in our house had already changed. Maplewood Heights wasn't quite as safe as it seemed. And deep down, I knew this wasn't going to be a one-off. After that first week, fear settled like dust on everything. I started noticing patterns, small, unsettling things that made me jump even before they happened. Greg's car would appear when we were outside, disappear when we ran in. Packages left at the curb seemed rearranged when we came back from the mailbox. Shadows moved oddly in our peripheral vision. One evening, Sophie and I were playing hide and seek. I was counting near the porch when she screamed. I raced upstairs and froze. Greg was standing across the street staring directly into her bedroom window. I shouted at him, "Get away from here." He smiled. A slow, calculated smile, and raised a finger to his lips. Then he walked away, like nothing happened. Dad filed a complaint with the police, but without evidence of a crime, there was little they could do. I watched our home become a stage for subtle terror. Mom tried to maintain normalcy, baking cookies and laughing at dinner table jokes, but the tension lingered, invisible but heavy. Sophie refused to play outside, and even Dad began leaving earlier for work, checking the driveway nervously. Late one night I heard noises again, soft at first, the scraping of shoes against gravel, the creak of our gate. I peeked through the blinds, heart pounding. A shadow moved near the backyard fence, not close enough to see clearly, but close enough to make my hands shake. That was the first night I realized. Greg wasn't just a problem next door. He had made us a target. And somehow it felt like he was always watching, waiting. It wasn't until a package arrived that things took a darker turn. A manila envelope slipped under the door. My mother opened it first, and her hands shook so violently I thought she might drop it. Inside were papers, fake legal documents accusing Dad of trespassing, claiming Sophie's treehouse violated some imaginary ordinance. "Do not test me. I watch, I wait, I know everything. Keep your family in line," the note read. The words burned into our minds. That night, I didn't sleep. Sophie curled into my side, trembling, whispering, "He's going to get us." Dad called the police again. Cameras were installed. A private investigator staked out the house. Footage showed him lurking in shadows, disappearing when approached, but never committing anything tangible. He wasn't just tormenting us, he was teaching us to fear, and it was working. Every day felt like a gauntlet. Every creak, every cough from the street made me freeze. I started walking Sophie to school, checking every corner, every neighbor's yard, every parked car. But Greg always found a way to show up, sometimes in the most mundane, unsettling moments. Waiting by the mailbox, parked outside a friend's house. It was relentless. Weeks turned into months, and the unease became routine. One night, around midnight, I woke to Sophie screaming. My heart nearly stopped. I sprinted down the hall and saw him, knife glinting under the porch light, laughing softly. Dad grabbed a baseball bat and charged, but he vanished before he reached him. That was the moment we realized. There was no negotiating with someone like Greg. Cameras, police, and precautions could only do so much. The terror was psychological, and he controlled it effortlessly. Life became a series of routines designed to avoid him. We double-checked locks, rerouted trips, and avoided any exposure. Friends visited less often, sensing the tension we could no longer hide. Sleep became a battlefield, and even our home, once a sanctuary, felt like a cage. Eventually, we moved to another part of town, hoping distance could erase fear. But the memories lingered. I still check the darkened windows of neighbors, imagining eyes watching, calculating. Sophie jumps at shadows in her new room. Dad sometimes hesitates before leaving for work. Mom bakes less frequently, distracted by the weight of what happened. The moral of our ordeal is painfully clear. Danger doesn't always come with a dramatic confrontation. Sometimes it is patient, subtle, and calculated. Evil can lurk behind a polite smile, in the neighbor next door, or in anyone who seems normal at first glance. And when it chooses to strike, it doesn't always need to cross the line of legality. Sometimes it simply erodes safety, day by day, shadow by shadow, until the world you trusted becomes unrecognizable. We learned that vigilance, awareness, and trust in intuition are as crucial as any lock or alarm. And sometimes the hardest truth is accepting that fear doesn't always disappear, even when the threat does. I never imagined that a simple move-in day could change everything. Cedar Grove, in Burlington, Vermont, was the kind of apartment complex that felt sleepy, yet safe. Rows of beige buildings framed by maple and oak trees, leaves crunching underfoot in the crisp autumn air. I'd lived in apartment 3B for 3 years, carving out a routine that balanced my graduate studies, thesis work, and quiet nights with my cat, Whiskers. My boyfriend, Ethan, often visited on weekends, but for the most part, I liked being alone. My life felt contained, predictable, safe. Then Luke Preston arrived. It started innocuously. I noticed the U-Haul van one afternoon, bright orange and clumsily parked near the lobby. A young man, mid-20s, struggled with boxes, eventually introducing himself with a nervous smile. "Hey, I'm Luke, just moved in across the hall." I waved, thinking little of it. Polite, awkward, young. He was exactly the type of neighbor you nodded to and forgot about. But over the next few days, my sense of calm began to fray. I noticed him lingering outside, sometimes just standing beneath my window. Maybe it was coincidence, I told myself. Maybe he was stretching, taking in the crisp air. But the instinct in my gut, the one that says something isn't right, refused to settle. The first truly alarming moment came at night, a week after he moved in. I was grading notes and sipping coffee when a soft rustling caught my attention. Through the blinds, I froze. Luke was perched in the giant maple tree outside my bedroom, motionless, staring at me. "Ethan, you won't believe this," I whispered into the phone, my voice trembling. By the time he arrived, Luke had vanished, slipping away like smoke. I reported it to the apartment office. Maybe he was pruning the tree? The manager said dismissively. My gut said no. Evenings became a subtle game of fear. Small objects appeared outside my door. Rocks, leaves, a single glove, arranged in patterns that made my skin crawl. Shadows under the window moved at odd times. Every glance from a balcony across the hall seemed deliberate. I began noticing small details. How Luke's eyes lingered when he thought I wasn't looking. How he sometimes loitered near my mailbox. The sense of being watched grew heavier with each day. I tried rationalizing it at first. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe I was imagining things. That illusion of normalcy shattered one evening around 10:30 p.m. Ethan and I were walking back from the library, books in hand, when Luke emerged from behind a hedge. "Hey," he said casually, too casually. "Nice night, isn't it?" There was something wrong with the way he smiled. His eyes didn't match the grin. Ethan kept walking, trying to ignore him, but Luke adjusted his pace to match ours. My voice shook when I finally spoke. "Nice to meet you. Again." He didn't reply, just walked alongside us until we reached the building, and even then the unease didn't dissipate. That night I couldn't sleep. Whiskers refused to settle, ears twitching at every creak. Shadows in the room seemed alive. I tried to convince myself it was over, that perhaps he just wanted to make friends. But deep down, I knew the truth. He had chosen to make me aware of him, to assert a presence that was intrusive, predatory in its subtlety. Weeks passed, and Luke's intrusions became more deliberate. I awoke one rainy night to scratching at the window. I peeked through the blinds and nearly dropped the phone in terror. Luke was in the tree again, staring down at me. Panic surged. I called 911. By the time officers arrived, he was gone. No trace, no explanation, only the lingering sense of being hunted. I installed blackout curtains, motion sensors, cameras. Ethan accompanied me whenever I left the apartment. Every step outside was calculated. Every shadow, a potential threat. Objects appeared on my doorstep again. Stones, twigs, cryptic notes. "I see you," one read. My sanctuary felt violated in ways I couldn't fight directly. Even the apartment office confronted him. Luke claimed misunderstandings, apologizing profusely, but my instincts told me otherwise. He had tested boundaries, recognized fear, and learned how to impose it without crossing legal lines. Living like that was suffocating. I avoided the balcony, stopped walking alone to the mailbox, and slept with the lights on. Even Ethan's presence couldn't erase the dread that crept into every corner of the apartment. Whiskers hissed at corners where nothing existed. I began questioning my own sanity. The psychological weight of it became unbearable when a note slipped under my door read, "I know your schedule. I see everything." The words carved a chill deep into my bones. It wasn't just curiosity, it was control, manipulation. Luke had created a constant atmosphere of anxiety, making me hyper-aware of every detail, every sound, every shadow. Eventually, Ethan and I moved to a different part of Burlington. We changed apartments, routines, even phone numbers. But the fear didn't leave immediately. I still jump at shadows, still check the corners of rooms before settling in. Whiskers reacts instinctively, hissing at empty spaces. The moral is stark. Danger doesn't always need force to be harmful. Sometimes, terror is psychological, exerted through observation, intrusion, and calculated intimidation. Trust your instincts, maintain boundaries, and understand that feeling unsafe isn't paranoia. It can be survival. Even when a threat leaves physically, its echoes remain. I learned that fear isn't just in actions, it's in presence, intention, and the invisible weight someone can place on your life. And sometimes the most chilling danger is not what you see, but what you feel is always watching. Moving to Crestwood Heights had felt like the perfect fresh start. Portland, Maine in winter had a crisp stillness, the streets blanketed with a thin layer of snow, muffling the usual city noise. At 25, I'd grown tired of the chaos of college towns and wanted a calm place where I could settle into my work as a remote graphic designer. Apartment 2D seemed ideal, small but cozy, with a view of a quiet courtyard lined with frost-tipped evergreens. I even adopted a golden retriever, Bailey, just for company. Life was predictable, safe, and structured, and I loved it that way. Then Eli Gardner moved in next door. He appeared one morning with a moving truck, a polite smile plastered on his face. On first impression, he seemed ordinary. Polite, slightly reserved, maybe shy. I introduced myself, even offered him a plate of cookies. He smiled, nodded, and thanked me. But something about the way his eyes darted, flicking across my apartment windows as if memorizing every detail, unsettled me. At the time, I told myself I was imagining things. Maybe it was the long winter shadows, or the quiet of the building playing tricks on me. It started small. Late evenings, I would notice him sitting on his balcony, perfectly still, staring. I waved awkwardly. He smiled politely, but the intensity of his gaze left a cold feeling in my chest. I brushed it off as coincidence. Maybe he liked winter nights. Maybe I was just paranoid. The building itself didn't help. Old walls, thin insulation, a creaky stairwell that sounded like it was groaning with every step. At night, when I worked late on designs, I would hear soft knocks or thuds from the apartment next door. Sometimes it was whispers, unintelligible but close enough to make me jump. Bailey would stiffen, ears perked, growling at nothing. It made me question whether I was overthinking, or if there really was something off about Eli. The first major incident came a week later. I returned home late one night from a client call, coffee still warm in my hands. My door was slightly ajar. Heart pounding, I froze. Everything inside seemed in place. Nothing was missing. I slammed the door shut and triple-checked the locks, my stomach tight. The following morning, I confronted Eli. My door. It was open last night, I said, keeping my voice steady despite the lingering panic. He shrugged casually, smiling too broadly. Must have been the wind. Old building, you know. But I wasn't convinced. Something about the calm in his tone, the lack of concern in his eyes felt deliberate. From that night onward, my sense of security dissolved into a quiet tension that never left. Shadows seemed sharper, every hallway corner held possibility, and I realized that my once safe apartment was no longer mine alone. At first, I tried rationalizing it. Old building, thin walls. dogs that bark at every sound. But it became harder to ignore the little things. Footsteps outside my door when no one was there, reflections in windows where movement didn't belong, or the sensation that someone was always just on the edge of vision. Eli's intrusions became more deliberate. I returned from work one evening to find him standing at the far end of the hallway, pretending to look at his mailbox but watching my apartment with a gaze that followed me the whole way inside. My stomach twisted. "Hey, Eli," I said casually, trying to mask my unease. He nodded, smiled faintly, then continued as if nothing had happened. Later, strange odors began emanating from his apartment, chemical tangs, burnt smells that made me nauseous. My mind wandered to dark possibilities, but I told myself I couldn't jump to conclusions. It could be anything. Maybe he cooked something unusual. Maybe it was a cleaning mishap. Then the noises started at night. Whispers, scraping sounds along the walls, a soft thud outside my bedroom door. Bailey would growl, hackles raised, ears pricked, refusing to settle even when I tried to comfort him. Sleep became sporadic. I left lights on, double-checked locks, and kept my phone close. The paranoia gnawed at me, but something primal in my gut insisted that Eli's presence was more than coincidental. One evening, around 11:15 p.m., I returned from a late client meeting. My hands were full of papers and my laptop bag. I noticed movement at the far end of the courtyard. Eli had emerged from behind a snowbank, standing too casually near the edge of the alley. "Nice night, isn't it?" he called, his voice oddly calm. I froze. The casual greeting masked something chilling. He wasn't just polite, he was observing. He wanted to be noticed. I nodded briefly and walked faster, but the tight knot in my chest didn't loosen. That night I couldn't sleep. Shadows from tree branches outside moved across the room like ghostly fingers. Bailey paced, whining softly, never settling. I realized then that my sense of safety had been violated, not physically, but mentally. I was living under constant surveillance and it was wearing me down. The first truly terrifying incident happened weeks later. I was taking out the trash at 1 a.m. The alley behind the building was silent except for the crunch of snow under my boots. At the end of the alley, standing under a flickering streetlight, was Eli. He hadn't been there 5 minutes before. I'd checked the bins, the path, the empty street. His gaze met mine directly. I froze. He raised a finger slowly to his lips, smiling faintly. A shiver ran down my spine. My first instinct was to run. And I did, heart hammering, breath freezing in the cold night. Back inside, I locked the door, called 911, and stayed on the phone until officers arrived. By the time they got there, Eli had vanished. Surveillance footage later confirmed what I suspected. He had been lurking outside my apartment multiple times, sometimes peering through windows, sometimes just waiting silently. I installed extra locks, blackout curtains, motion sensor lights. I never walked alone at night. I became hyper-aware of every sound. The scrape of shoes in the hallway, the whisper of the wind, the creak of the stairwell. Objects occasionally seemed moved, though I could never be sure. Every day became a psychological struggle to maintain calm, to convince myself I wasn't losing control of my mind. Weeks turned into months. Sleep became a luxury. Every knock, every creak of the building, every shadow was a potential threat. Even when I tried to focus on work, my mind wandered to him, Eli, always watching, always present, just beyond perception. Friends suggested stronger action, more police reports, restraining orders, mediation. But without tangible harm, there was little that could be done. Building management pushed for polite resolution, but Eli's polite demeanor was a mask. The tension escalated to the point where every simple action, checking mail, walking to the lobby, doing laundry, felt like navigating a minefield. My life shrank within the walls of my apartment, yet even there, he intruded through sight, sound, and imagination. Eventually, I found a new apartment in South Portland and moved quickly, leaving behind the space I had once loved. Physically, I was safe, but the psychological imprint remained. Months later, I still jump at footsteps. Bailey still growls at empty corridors, and I can't shake the sensation of being watched in new spaces. The lesson is clear. Safety is fragile. Threats are not always obvious, and danger doesn't always need to be physical to be real. Someone can invade your life through observation, presence, and subtle manipulation, wearing down your sense of security until every shadow feels like a threat. Trust your instincts, set boundaries, and recognize that even polite facades can conceal obsession. Awareness and vigilance can't eliminate fear, but they can keep you from being powerless in the face of it. When Claire and I moved into 128 Willow Lane in Hawthorne Oaks, I honestly thought it was the start of a perfect chapter in our lives. Columbus, Ohio in the summer had that sticky humidity that clung to your skin, but the streets of our neighborhood were quiet, lined with mature oak trees that stretched their branches across the roads like protective arms. Claire was managing her small online boutique, working from home, while I logged hours as a software engineer. Our daughter Lila, barely 3, was full of energy, laughing and learning to run faster than I could catch. Life felt stable, predictable, and for the first time in years, I truly felt like home had a heartbeat. Then it started. The first instance seemed trivial at first. It was a Thursday night, humid enough that the windows were slightly fogged. Claire was putting Lila to bed when faint knocking came from the front door. "Must be the neighbor," she whispered to herself. I was in the home office, my laptop screen reflecting lines of code. I barely looked up, assuming it was nothing. But she mentioned it again, worry threading through her voice, and I got up to check. Nothing. No packages, no one on the porch. Just the shadows of the oak trees stretching into the night. That night, sleep felt heavier, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Even with the windows closed, every creak sounded amplified. Every rustle outside became an imagined threat. I chalked it up to nerves, to new homeowner jitters, but a subtle chill settled in, one I couldn't shake. The next evening, the knocking returned, this time at the back door. Claire woke me, whispering urgently, "Marcus, I swear someone's out there." I grabbed a flashlight, cautiously stepping onto the porch, heart thumping. The yard was empty, dark, and still, except for the sway of the trees. I tried to laugh it off. "It's probably just a raccoon," I said. But the instinct in the pit of my stomach told me otherwise. Over the following week, things escalated subtly. Doors rattled at odd times. Windows tapped as if someone was leaning against them. Occasionally, heavy footsteps echoed across the backyard, pacing with intent. Motion sensor lights and a small camera didn't help. The footage was either empty or blurred, shadows moving in ways that didn't make sense. Claire started sleeping lightly, Lila awaking at every unfamiliar sound. Something, or someone, was watching, and the presence grew heavier every night. By the end of that week, I realized this was no random prank. Someone had chosen us, and our sense of security, the one thing we took for granted, was slipping through our fingers. It happened late one night, around 12:30 a.m., the kind of still hour when every house feels suspended in time. Claire woke me suddenly, panic in her voice. "Marcus, there's someone at the bedroom window." I rolled over, trying to calm my racing heart. "It's probably just a branch, Claire." But when I followed her gaze, my own blood ran cold. A figure stood outside, cloaked in black, a hood obscuring his face. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, silent, deliberate, threatening in his stillness. "Call 911, Claire hissed. I froze, torn between grabbing the phone and confronting the stranger. I stepped outside, flashlight in hand, and the figure lunged, shoving me back before vanishing into the darkness. Minutes later, police arrived, combing the yard, checking the surrounding streets. No one was found. Just a lingering dread, a whisper of presence that refused to leave. That night, I lay awake beside Claire, Lila asleep between us. I realized then that physical harm wasn't necessary for terror. The mere act of intrusion, the unseen vigilance, had invaded our lives. We had been chosen, observed, and hunted in the most subtle way possible. The next weeks were a blur of precaution and paranoia. Locks were reinforced with deadbolts, curtains drawn permanently, and I installed a professional security system with night vision cameras. Every motion detected became a trigger for anxiety. Even daylight couldn't erase the feeling of being observed. I noticed fleeting shadows when mowing the lawn, a black shape disappearing behind neighboring houses, figures in the periphery that melted away when looked at directly. Claire grew restless, unable to sleep. Lila started waking, screaming, crying for reasons that made little sense. Every routine, going for a walk, taking out the trash, even opening the garage, became an ordeal. The neighborhood, once peaceful, now felt like a stage for an unseen predator. Friends suggested we file reports, involve the police further, or even move, but life's responsibilities and Lila's schooling made a hasty exit complicated. Each evening was a test of endurance. I'd stand at the window, scanning the darkness, flashlight and phone in hand, trying to anticipate any movement. Every creak of the house, every whisper of wind through the leaves, every car passing on the street became a potential threat. We were prisoners in our own home, bound by the invisible thread of fear the Night Stalker had woven around us. Weeks turned into relentless psychological warfare. I noticed Claire flinching at shadows during the day. Lila sometimes pointed at corners and whimpered. Even my work was interrupted by moments of hypervigilance, scanning emails, code, and messages while mentally checking doors and windows. The most chilling part was the uncertainty. We never saw him clearly, never heard him speak, never understood his intent. The unknown was worse than a known threat. It forced constant vigilance, making even the most mundane tasks, a trip to the mailbox, a walk around the block, feel impossible without fear. Our conversations became tense. Claire would whisper, "Did you see anything?" And I'd shake my head, though my stomach twisted with unease. The paranoia seeped into everything. Our relationships, our work, our sleep. This presence, though fleeting and unseen, dictated our lives. Eventually, we made the decision to move to a gated community several miles away, far from the shadows of Hawthorne Oaks. The Night Stalker never returned physically, never confronted us directly, but the psychological scars remained. Claire jumps at noises. Lila flinches at shadows. I constantly check locks, windows, and cameras, even in the daylight of our new home. The moral of our ordeal is hauntingly simple. Danger doesn't always announce itself with violence. Sometimes terror is silent, subtle, and unseen, yet just as real. Trust your instincts. Protect your boundaries. Understand that fear can be inflicted without a single scratch, leaving scars invisible yet enduring. The Night Stalker didn't steal our possessions or harm our bodies, but he stole our peace of mind, teaching a lesson I'll never forget. Safety is fragile, and vigilance is never optional. Even when the threat disappears, its shadow lingers, shaping every corner of your life.